We've got a couple of charts for you and a few other topics we can talk about. What you're gonna see here is the historic average hourly earnings for black and white people per hour. There are a lot of ways that you can measure economic success and outcomes, obviously. But this is one of them. And you see there, going back to before the 80s, there has been something like parity between white and black men. Some ups, some down. You see that both did pretty well through the mid to late 90s. With very, very slow rises over that and some backsliding. But the gap has never really gotten smaller. And you see that for women, the gap is smaller, but it is increasing over time as white women are doing slightly better as we get to the modern era.
So there's a couple of things here. One is about race, as you just pointed out there. Unfortunately, in some ways it's worse now. Also about wealth overall, and we were talking about how on this 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, he was about to lead the Poor People's Campaign right before he was killed. And the bottom half of American earners have stagnated since he passed. So unfortunately, no help for the poor people that he was trying to help as he was killed. While the top 1% of American earners have tripled their average income. So a light for the rest of us was snuffed out, and then we got no help. Where the top 1% kept rising and rising. So I want to show the next chart here from Vox as well. They did a good job putting this together. That's the black unemployment rate versus the white unemployment rate. So the black unemployment rate has continued to be higher, and so we have not closed the gap, and that is greatly frustrating. But I wanted to point out one other thing about this chart. If you notice, obviously they move in tandem. So when unemployment rises for whites, it also rises for blacks. When it dips for whites, it also dips for blacks. I point that out because the right wing will say that things like unemployment are a matter of moral character, and they will imply that the culture of African Americans is what creates unemployment, which of course is, first of all, factually and morally preposterous. But as you look at this chart, it becomes exceedingly clear. No, it's clearly the economic patterns that are affecting the country. So the unemployment for whites and blacks move at the same exact time. It's not like when black unemployment spikes, all of a sudden they lost their moral character. And what a coincidence, so did white people at the same time. So
the white people were dragged down, obviously. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and at the same time, the fact that we have not been able to close the gap, and there have been many, many studies about if you take away all the other factors, including socioeconomic position and communities that you live in, et cetera, you still have a gap, and that is attributed to, unfortunately, bias, because there are no other factors left. Yeah. So for example, and you might have heard this one before, this is fairly famous, although a lot of people haven't heard it. So if you take a stereotypical white name and a stereotypical black name and you put it on resumes, the stereotypically white name gets called in for an interview 50% more, just on name alone. The resume is identical otherwise. Study after study has shown that, and unfortunately, since Dr. King has passed away, it has not gotten better.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't have a ton of time, but to some extent, the average income almost hides how bad it is, because when you look at overall wealth, sort of not your year-by-year income, but what you've accumulated, it's far worse, far worse. Over the past several decades, it's gone up slightly for black and Hispanic households, but it has gone up fairly well for white households. And a lot of that has less to do with the economy day by day or year by year now, but it's the accrued gains of having houses, growing up in houses, being able to pass that on, using it to produce the money necessary for your kids to go to college. It's the wealth of past generations helps to produce more wealth for future generations, and if you held back the past generations, you are thereby holding back future ones as well. There's things like the persistence of school segregation, which has not improved that much over the past 30 or 40 years. In some areas, has actually gotten worse. The gap in college completion records between the races is still significant. You have the rise of mass incarceration, which is in some ways worse than it was back during that time, and a number of other metrics like this. Things that we obviously should have done much better on. And you can look at the charts. We're not showing you anything that wasn't freely available on income or wealth or any of that. And you can look at that and you can see under what periods things have gotten better and where they've gotten worse, and you can draw some lessons from there. But overall, the lesson is that even when things are getting better, they're not getting better fast enough, and we haven't reached where we need to be.
So last two things on that, and one is the good news, which is high school completion rates for African Americans and whites have caught up, and so they're nearly the same now. Hey, look, so some improvement in some areas, but it also goes to show you, if you try, it turns out you can have success. We actually did try to increase the graduation rates in high schools for African Americans. And we did it, right? As a country, as a society. And in a lot of other areas, we never bothered to try. So remember, when African Americans were freed after the Civil War, they all started, not all, but most, overwhelming majority started with zero. They started with zero. So you have to make an effort, because history has cascading consequences. So which leads to prisons. Why has it in a lot of these categories gotten worse, not better, since Martin Luther King passed away? The prison industrial complex. And so the war on drugs has imprisoned about 1.5 million African American men. And so that is a stunningly high number. And as some scholars have pointed out, there are now more African American men in prison. Of course, the population has gone up. Everybody understands that, but still it is a stunning fact. More African American males in prison now than there were slaves at the end of the Civil War. So male slaves. So we made those decisions. We decided to do the war on drugs and made marijuana illegal when we didn't need to. And in fact, Richard Nixon, his aide admitted it later in the 1990s, said, yeah, we did the war on drugs partly to imprison our political opponents, the liberal hippies and the blacks. They targeted blacks on purpose. These are not accidents. They made active decisions. We need to reverse those decisions so we could at least get on the path to justice. The moral arc of the universe might bend towards justice, but we gotta help it bend. That's our job. So let's work together to make that happen. You just watched the video by the Young Turks, the home of the revolution. If you'd like to get the full show, come join us and become a member. tytnetwork.com/join.